Most mornings in Kingsford, Oregon began in quiet layers, thin fog over pine roofs, coffee brewing behind frosted windows, and the steady hum of a town that believed it had seen everything. But that belief shattered at 9:42 a.m. on a Tuesday. Officer Dean Callahan had been on patrol with his K-9 partner Briggs, a 5-year-old German shepherd known in the department as the spine of the team. Briggs didn't bark at squirrels. He didn't react to sirens. He was trained for narcotics, cadaver detection, and high-threat interventions. He followed commands with military precision. Always. That's why, when Briggs started growling from the back of the cruiser as they passed Kingsford Federal Courthouse, Dean's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "You okay, boy?" he asked, glancing through the rearview mirror. But Briggs didn't settle. The dog's ears were up, nose twitching, body tense. He let out a single low bark, then a second, short, sharp, not aggression. Alert, Dean slowed down and flicked on his hazard lights, heart pulsing harder than he cared to admit. There was no call to respond to, no threat bulletin about the courthouse. It was just another landmark on his loop. Until now. The moment Dean opened the back door, Briggs lunged forward. Not wildly, not without focus, but with intent. Leash clipped, nose to the wind, muscles like coiled wire. He pulled hard, dragging Dean across the courthouse sidewalk and up the granite steps before the officer could fully react. Inside the lobby, the buzz of scanners and murmur of legal aids hung like static. Nothing seemed amiss. Security guards gave casual nods. The day was routine, polished, almost sterile. But Briggs didn't care about routine. He charged straight through the security gate, tail stiff, eyes scanning like radar. Dean flashed his badge as startled officers stepped forward. "K-9 unit, he's tracking something." "What is it?" one asked. Dean shook his head. "I don't know." That's what made it worse. The dog veered left past courtroom A, then right, paws skidding against the waxed floors. He didn't hesitate, didn't falter. When he reached the double doors of courtroom C, he stopped so abruptly that Dean almost stumbled. Inside, Judge Evelyn Harper was presiding over a custody dispute. A tight-lipped attorney argued for placement. A foster agency supervisor looked on. A 9-year-old Lucy Ramirez sat quietly on the padded bench behind the plaintiff's table, legs dangling. Her eyes were still. Watchful. Briggs growled, low but sharp. Dean hesitated. These were federal proceedings, sealed hearings. He had no legal grounds to interrupt, but Briggs had already decided. He pushed his weight against the doors, forcing one ajar with a heavy thud. The entire courtroom fell silent. "Callahan?" Judge Harper's voice snapped across the room. "What's the meaning of—" But Briggs bolted forward. Dean shouted, "Briggs, heel!" But it was no use. The dog flew down the aisle, past the legal teams, past the startled clerk, and made a hard right behind the judge's bench. His nose dropped to the baseboard and then he ducked, squeezed under the elevated platform through a narrow space no adult could possibly reach. Seconds later, a sound cut through the stunned silence. A whimper. Not from the dog, from a child. Dean rushed forward, crouched low beside the judge's bench, and tilted his flashlight beneath. His breath caught. A tiny girl, no older than 4, curled into a trembling ball. Her arms wrapped around a dirt-stained bunny plush. Her shoes were off. Her lips were pale. Her name would later be confirmed as Emma Lee Parsons, reported missing 3 hours earlier after her grandmother had briefly stepped away during a visit to the clerk's office. No one had seen her disappear. Until now. The courtroom erupted into carefully controlled chaos. Paramedics were called. The session recessed. Attorneys and staff clustered near the exit in hushed disbelief. Dean stayed kneeling, helping Briggs guide the girl gently out from her hiding place. She clung to his uniform like a life raft. Her first words were barely audible. "Is the dog staying?" Briggs didn't move. He sat beside her like a sentinel. The girl's vitals were low but stable. She was dehydrated, mildly hypothermic and terrified, but alive. EMTs swaddled her and carried her out into the Oregon morning, while Briggs followed close, silent and proud. Dean stood just inside the door, breath heavy, watching as the building tried to resume its heartbeat. But one thing wouldn't let go: Lucy Ramirez. She hadn't flinched when Briggs stormed in, hadn't gasped like the others. In fact, she'd stood up the moment Briggs barked. And when the toddler was found, Lucy was the first to kneel beside her. She whispered in Spanish, gentle tones no one else in the room seemed to notice. And the child responded, like she knew that voice, or at least the calm inside it. Dean made a note of it. Not suspicion, just instinct. The courtroom had returned to a semblance of order, at least on the surface. EMTs had carried out Emma Lee, now wrapped in a thermal blanket, her tiny frame still trembling, clutching a stuffed giraffe stained with dust. The judge recessed the hearing indefinitely, citing unforeseen trauma to a minor. Lawyers packed their briefcases in stiff silence. Reporters circled like sharks at the courthouse gates, hungry for any scrap of detail. But inside that room, what lingered wasn't noise. It was a silence too sharp to ignore. Dean Callahan leaned against the far wall, watching Briggs pace the rear aisle, nose down, tail stiff. The dog hadn't settled since they left the bench. Not even after the girl had been found. Dean knew that look. Briggs was still working, still unsettled, still searching. But it wasn't Briggs who held Dean's attention. It was the girl sitting on the second bench from the front, Lucy Ramirez. 9 years old, silent as snowfall, hands folded on her lap. She hadn't cried when Briggs had barreled through the courtroom. She hadn't screamed when the hidden child was found under the judge's bench. In fact, she hadn't moved at all. Her expression hadn't cracked. Not fear, not shock, just calm, like she had expected it all. She had walked to Emma Lee after the medics checked her, knelt beside her, and whispered softly in Spanish until the younger girl stopped sobbing. The courtroom had dozens of eyes, but in that moment Dean realized Lucy was the only one Emma Lee had looked at. Later, in the hallway outside chambers, Judge Evelyn Harper requested a private word. Her robe was gone, replaced by a gray cardigan and a mug of tea that read, "Justice and Caffeine." She gestured for Dean to sit. "I've presided over 2,000 custody hearings," she said. "Never seen anything like that." Her eyes flicked to Briggs, resting beside Dean's boots. What exactly was he tracking? Dean exhaled slowly. No drugs, no weapons, he doesn't false flag. He locked on the moment we passed the building, and once we were in, he didn't hesitate. Harper tapped a file with her index finger. Emma Lee Parsons was reported missing inside this building at 9:41 a.m. Her grandmother assumed she'd wandered into a public restroom. Security didn't want to raise alarm during active hearings, so they started a quiet search. Dean nodded. "And nobody thought to check under the bench?" Harper's face tightened. "Not until your partner did." She slid a folder across the table. Inside were stills from security footage. Dean leaned in. There it was. Time-stamped at 9:43, a tiny blur of color. A girl crawling beneath the judge's dais before the bailiff sealed the doors. No one noticed, but Lucy had. Dean glanced at a second image. Lucy in the gallery. Her eyes weren't on the judge or her lawyers. They were pointed straight ahead, toward the bench, toward Emily's hiding spot. That night, Dean couldn't shake the feeling. At home, he poured himself a finger of bourbon he didn't want and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the tile floor while Briggs circled the perimeter like a guard on rotation. The dog's nerves hadn't settled. Every creak in the wood, every shift in wind against the window made him twitch. Dean opened the case report again, then clicked through footage from earlier that day, the entryway the moment they'd arrived. Briggs had gone still, then tense, then explosive, as if someone had flipped a switch only he could hear. Dean's phone buzzed. A text from Officer Layla Dorn at dispatch. Security cams being reviewed. FYI, Emily entered court alone. Grandmother was at the clerk's desk. He stared at the message. Alone? How does a 4-year-old navigate a public courthouse without a single adult intervening? Across the room, Briggs let out a low huff. Not a bark, just an exhale, like a breath from someplace deeper. The next morning, Dean returned to the precinct early. He wasn't on duty yet, but he wanted access to the courthouse footage before it cycled out of the system. He flagged down IT, got clearance, and sat alone in a dim media room with a screen split into quadrants. Lobby cam, hallway cam, courtroom B entrance, and gallery view. Time, 9:38 a.m. He watched. Emily wandered in through the main doors, small and slow, pausing near a vending machine. A janitor passed her without looking. A clerk passed the other way. She turned toward courtroom B. A man opened the door ahead of her, talking on a cell phone. She slipped in quietly behind him. No one noticed. Dean leaned in. 9:43, she crawled under the bench. The footage continued. People entered, lawyers, clerks. Finally, Lucy Ramirez and her foster caseworker. Lucy sat, eyes straight ahead. But then something odd happened. At 9:51, Lucy leaned forward, resting her chin on her hands, and stared at the bench. Her lips moved. Dean paused the screen, zoomed in. She wasn't talking to anyone beside her. She was mouthing something. He played it again. Not words, not a name, a rhythm, a breath. Dean knew that sound. He'd heard it when kids tried to soothe dogs in shelters. A quiet pulse, meant to calm. She wasn't nervous. She was comforting someone. Downstairs in the break room, Briggs growled at the sound of a janitor's mop bucket scraping the tiles too close. Dean glanced over his shoulder. Nothing there. But Briggs didn't lie. Later that afternoon, Dean approached Lucy's social worker at the foster center. "Just want to check in," he said carefully, "about the girl in court yesterday." The woman, middle-aged and overworked, gave him a tired smile. "Lucy Ramirez? Tough kid. Been bounced between 5 placements, smart as a whip. Doesn't trust anyone." "Not even you?" Dean asked. "Especially not me," the woman said. "But she loves animals. Spends every weekend reading in the shelter kennels. That's how she calms down." Dean nodded slowly. "That tracks." That evening, Briggs refused to sleep in his usual spot. He stood, tail rigid, staring at the front door for nearly an hour. Dean finally sat beside him on the floor. "You're not unsettled because of what you found," he murmured, hand resting on the thick ruff of the shepherd's neck. "You're unsettled because something's still there." He didn't know if he meant the courtroom, or the girl, or both. But he knew one thing for certain: this wasn't just a rescue. It was the beginning of something much deeper. Something still buried, still breathing, and Briggs had no intention of looking away. The morning after the incident at the courthouse, Officer Dean Callahan stood alone inside courtroom 3B. The soft creak of his boots against the old hardwood echoed across the empty gallery. Outside, Kingsford was waking slowly, coffee brewing, cars rolling over damp pavement. But in here, the silence felt sharper, like the air itself was holding its breath. Briggs moved beside him, more alert than usual. His movements were cautious, nose low, body tense. Dean didn't need commands anymore. The dog was working from instinct now, just as he had the day before. Something had drawn him beneath the judge's bench then, and Dean hadn't stopped thinking about it since. Lucy's words echoed in his mind. He didn't bark because she was scared. He barked because someone told her to hide. Dean crouched beside the platform, ran his hand across the underside. The grain of the wood was worn smooth in places, but in others there were gouges, scratches. Small ones, almost like the markings from fingernails. Briggs pressed his nose near a vent nestled at floor level. He gave a low whine, pawed gently. Dean loosened the metal grill. It came off with a soft pop, exposing a narrow shaft lined with dust and forgotten debris. He reached in with his gloved hand, expecting nothing, and instead pulled out a faded piece of fabric. Brittle from age, it was the corner of a child's blanket, the kind with rounded edges and satin trim, long discolored. Along one hem, barely visible, was a single embroidered letter, M. Dean stared at it, heart knocking. Not E for Emily, not L for Lucy. M. He went straight to records. The courthouse archives were stored 2 floors down, managed by a clerk named Tom Brinks, who seemed more comfortable with paper than people. Dean requested access to incident files from the 1990s. At first, Brinks refused, but once Dean showed him the fabric, the man's face went pale, and the lock on the cabinet gave way with a trembling key. The missing child report was buried under layers of bureaucracy, forgotten or ignored. Mia Holloway, age 6, vanished in this very courthouse on October 17, 1999. The record was short, disturbingly so. She had been brought in for a custody hearing. Her parents were in the building. She had been playing near the hallway. Then she was gone. The file ended with 3 stamped words, "Case closed, unresolved." Briggs stood still beside Dean, ears forward, sensing the shift. Dean whispered, "We found her blanket." But it wasn't just the record that chilled him. It was the name attached to the courtroom assignment, Raymond Eller. Back then, a junior bailiff. Now, still working, tucked away in the archive room across the hallway. Same man, same building. Dean looked out through the glass window that overlooked the hallway. Eller's office light was on. That evening, Dean returned to his squad car, restless. Briggs paced the length of the living room when they got home, ignoring food, ignoring water, stopping every few minutes to stare at the front door like he expected someone to walk through it. The dog wasn't reacting to noise or movement. He was reacting to something else. Something felt. Something old. At midnight, Dean woke from a dreamless sleep to the sound of Briggs growling low, steady. The kind of growl that only came when the dog knew danger was near. Dean rose, hand instinctively reaching for the gun on his nightstand. But there was no noise, no threat. Only the stillness of a house on alert. He knelt beside Briggs and whispered, "What is it, boy?" But the dog wouldn't move. His nose pointed toward the closed window, his body rigid. Dean checked the window locks. Nothing broken, no signs of entry. Just the darkness outside and the breath of the wind in the trees. But when he returned to the couch, he found something that hadn't been there before. A folded envelope, no address, no stamp, just 3 handwritten words in blocky ink. Let it lie. No return address, no fingerprints, just threat masked as advice. The next morning, Dean filed an internal report and requested silent cooperation from the State Bureau of Investigation. He knew what he was doing might shake the foundations of Kingsford. But something told him it had to be done. Briggs didn't just bark for noise. He never had. By noon, he returned to the vent beneath the bench with a forensic team. What they uncovered made the air in the room collapse. Behind the vent, deeper inside the shaft, was a small metal charm, rusted, heart-shaped, with the name Mia etched faintly into the back. Alongside it, threads of fabric too degraded to identify, and a thin ribbon, the kind tied in a child's braid. Dean didn't speak. He couldn't. The air was too full of something unspoken, grief that had waited 2 decades to be felt. Outside, the courthouse buzzed with its usual rhythm. Files shuffled, names called, gavels pounded. But beneath all that, a different beat had returned. One long buried. And it had a name. Mia Holloway. The basement of the Kingsford courthouse had always held a certain chill. The kind that didn't come from poor insulation but from something deeper. An old, unsettling silence that clung to the pipes and settled into the walls like a secret no one dared speak aloud. Dean Callahan stood at the threshold of the restricted access corridor, the dim glow of his flashlight carving thin slices of light through the musty dark. Beside him, Briggs moved with unusual caution, his breath short and ears locked forward. The warrant had come through that morning, quietly signed by Judge Harper herself. There was no press, no local PD chatter, just a few trusted agents from the State Bureau and a tight-lipped forensics tech team. Everything about this was meant to stay small until it couldn't. Dean's boots echoed off the old tile as they crossed the hallway, passing unused storage rooms and forgotten breaker panels. Briggs suddenly veered toward a corner utility closet, his body low and tense. Dean knew that stance. It wasn't curiosity, it was certainty. He reached for the old handle. Locked. The key from courthouse security clicked after a moment's effort. The door creaked open, revealing a room packed with chemicals, mops, and disused equipment, and a section of flooring that didn't match. The linoleum in the far corner was newer, less scuffed, not sunken like the rest. Briggs moved to it without hesitation and sat, tail rigid, body pointed like a compass needle. Dean knelt beside him, heart thudding in a slow, deliberate rhythm. He peeled back the edge of the linoleum with his knife, revealing wood, old, warped panels arranged in a square. Nails rusted into place. He didn't need to say anything. The forensic team moved in, tools ready. Boards were pulled back one by one until the cavity beneath opened into a shallow pit. A small, pink sneaker. A rotting child's blanket. And the unmistakable shape of fragmented bones. Dean turned away for a beat, swallowing the bile that rose to his throat. Even in years of service, combat zones, domestic calls, missing persons cases, nothing compared to this. This wasn't a battlefield. It was a betrayal of a sacred place, a courthouse, a place people came for truth. One of the techs held up a rusted keychain. The letters etched into the metal tag were faint but readable. Mia. The room fell silent. Even the hum of the overhead lights felt like an intrusion. Briggs lay down beside the opening, his body curved as if protecting what little was left to protect. That evening, the news broke. Kingsford's courthouse was now the center of a state-level homicide investigation. The media began circling like hawks. But Raymond Eller, he was gone. Security footage showed him leaving the building just minutes after Emma Lee had been discovered. No fanfare, no sudden panic. He had simply walked out in his maintenance uniform, pushing his mop cart toward the service elevator. No one noticed. No one stopped him. Dean sat in his cruiser hours later, rewatching the footage frame by frame. Briggs curled up in the back seat, still tense. The janitor's steps were calm, almost rehearsed, as if he had always known this day would come. Back at headquarters, no one had answers. Eller's personnel file was clean. No criminal history, no red flags. He'd worked in the building for over 20 years, Most people barely remembered his name. He'd been there the day Mia Holloway vanished in 1999. He had cleaned the courtroom after her custody hearing, courtroom 4B. The same room Emma Lee had been found in. Dean pulled up schematics of the courthouse and noticed something odd. An old maintenance tunnel once used for HVAC repairs, running beneath the building from the boiler room to the archival wing. It had been decommissioned decades ago and never sealed properly. The next morning, Dean and Briggs visited Eller's house on the edge of town. It was quiet, empty, but Briggs picked up a scent immediately, one that led around the back to a garden shed. Inside was nothing but cleaning supplies, an old map pinned to the wall, and a marked route. Red ink circled a section of tunnel beneath the courthouse, an arrow pointing to courtroom 4B. A note scrawled in rough handwriting beside it read, "Keep it closed, keep it quiet." Dean backed out slowly. His pulse pounded in his ears, not from fear, but from the sinking certainty that everything they'd uncovered had been hidden not just by accident, but by intent. Someone had ensured Mia was never found. Someone had turned the court's silence into a grave. Later that night, Dean sat on his front porch, staring out at the quiet street. Briggs rested at his feet, one paw twitching like in a dream, but Dean knew his partner wasn't sleeping. He looked down and whispered, "You didn't just save a girl. You unearthed a grave." And somewhere, in the shadows between memory and justice, he knew the past was finally fighting to be heard. The air in Kingsford shifted after the discovery. What had once been a quiet, predictable courthouse at the edge of a forest town was now the center of something far heavier, a reckoning. Yellow tape still hung across the utility corridor. Reporters clustered at the iron gates, hoping to catch a sliver of the story that had unraveled like rot beneath wood. But for Dean Callahan, the real story was quieter than headlines. It lived in the hollow silence of courtroom 4B, in the seams beneath the bench, in the eyes of a child who never got to leave. Raymond Eller was found 70 miles east in a rundown hunting cabin tucked deep within the Ochoco forest. A seasonal ranger had spotted the smoke, recognized the man from the news, and made the call. Eller was unarmed. When brought in, he didn't resist. He looked tired, hollow, as if he'd already served time in his own mind. In the interview room, Eller barely lifted his gaze. He admitted to being there in '99, admitted to hearing Mia cry in panic when left alone before the hearing, said he only meant to scare her, to hush her before court began. She wouldn't stop. He panicked, locked her beneath the bench to keep her quiet. He thought she would calm down, but the air was thin. The vent hadn't opened in years. "She just stopped," he said, "and I couldn't undo it." Dean stood on the other side of the two-way mirror, arms crossed, jaw tight. There was no triumph in justice this time. Only grief, dulled by years and buried in dust. Briggs had not barked once since the arrest. It was as if his job had ended when the last secret had surfaced. News coverage exploded. Cold case solved after 24 years. K9 uncovers child's remains. Kingsford shaken. But the town, small and weathered, knew how to close its doors against noise. The ceremony came quietly. A bronze plaque was mounted at the foot of the old bench in courtroom 4B. It read, "In memory of Mia Holloway, 1993 to 1999. You were never lost, only waiting to be found." That day, Lucy Ramirez stood beside Judge Harper in a white dress, holding a small bouquet of lilies. The judge had insisted on including her. Lucy had become the unwitting thread between two children, one rescued, one remembered. Emily Parsons, still undergoing therapy, clung to a small plush dog. She wouldn't speak in groups yet, but when she saw Briggs, her face lit up with something fragile but undeniable: trust. Dean had already filed his retirement papers before the ceremony. Not because of the case, but because he knew the work wasn't what he wanted anymore. He'd seen what Briggs could do beyond patrol and protocols. That dog hadn't just sniffed out danger. He'd sensed something unspoken, something human. By spring, Dean had purchased a small plot of land just outside Kingsford and converted it into a training center for K9 therapy. One focused on pairing retired service dogs with children recovering from trauma. The place had no sirens, just trees, sunlight, and space to heal. Briggs, now semi-retired, slept more. But when Lucy visited on weekends, now in the care of a new family from Corvallis, he would still rise, tail wagging slow and proud. She once asked Dean if dogs could remember ghosts. He didn't know how to answer that. But some nights, when the wind rattled through the trees, Briggs would sit by the fence line and look out toward town, ears perked. Not in alarm, but like he was listening. Watching. Weeks passed. The courthouse returned to routine, though quieter. Emma Lee, after months of therapy, began to speak again. Her first sentence came during a visit to Dean's training grounds. She'd whispered into Briggs's fur, "I'm not hiding anymore." That spring, at Kingsford Elementary, Lucy stood on stage during the school's Heroes in Our Lives presentation. Her note cards trembled in her hands, but her voice didn't. "He barked not to be heard," she said. "He barked because someone finally listened." Briggs lay at her feet, perfectly still, as if he knew the moment wasn't his to own, but to witness. The bench in courtroom 4B was replaced, but the new one was made of glass, transparent, light passing through it each morning like something holy. Dean never went back inside that room. He didn't need to. Everything that had once been buried beneath that bench had risen, carried not by anger, but by the steady pulse of a dog's instinct and a town's refusal to look away any longer. Sometimes justice doesn't arrive with flashing lights. Sometimes it waits, in silence, in courage, in the hearts of children who know more than we ever give them credit for. And sometimes, when it's finally time, it doesn't knock, it barks.